A sharp cry pierced the quiet afternoon by the lake. "Help! Somebody! Please! My boy!" People froze, staring at the surface of the water where a child's small hands thrashed desperately. Panic rippled through the crowd. Yet no one moved closer to the edge. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers shouted in confusion. And on the weathered bench, half hidden beneath the shade of a willow tree, the old man everyone dismissed as useless lifted his head. The scream ripped across the park like a blade. It was raw, high-pitched, the kind of sound that didn't just pass through the ears but lodged itself in the chest. Heads turned, conversations halted, the rhythm of a lazy Sunday fractured into shards of panic. "Help! My boy, he's in the water." At the far edge of Willow Lake, a small pair of arms flailed helplessly above the surface. A boy, no more than 7 or 8, gasped between gulps of water, his head bobbing up and down like a boy fighting a storm. Each time he surfaced, the terror in his eyes widened, then disappeared again beneath the cold green waves. The lake looked deceptively calm from a distance, its ripples reflecting the late afternoon sun. But everyone in town knew the stories. Willow Lake dropped steeply only a few feet from the shore. The bottom was slick with algae and silt. Even strong swimmers could lose their footing there. The child had no chance on his own. People gathered quickly, drawn as much by fear as by instinct. Mothers yanked their children back from the water's edge. Fathers shouted conflicting instructions, pointing but not moving. One man waded in up to his knees before freezing, shaking his head, whispering that he couldn't swim. Another woman cried into her hands, begging someone, anyone, to act. Yet no one did, except him. On a bench a few yards away, beneath the sagging branches of a willow, sat the man no one noticed until now. He was always there, every day, rain or shine, the old man in the frayed jacket, his shoes worn to threads, his hair unkempt. To the town, he was furniture at best, a burden at worst, a man who had nothing left to offer. Children sometimes mocked him, calling him a ghost of the park. Adults dismissed him with a shake of the head, whispering words like drunk, crazy, or worse. But when the boy's scream split the air, his head lifted, his eyes, pale blue and sharper than anyone remembered, locked on the water. The crowd was noise, panicked cries, useless shouts, the slap of shoes against the gravel path. But in his ears, there was only silence. He didn't feel the weight of years in his bones, didn't notice the ache in his knees as he stood. For the first time in so long, his body remembered purpose. He moved. It wasn't graceful. His limp was obvious, his gait uneven, yet there was a steadiness in him that cut through the chaos. Step after step, he closed the distance, ignoring the startled looks and muttered disbelief. Someone muttered, "That useless old man, he'll only make it worse." He reached the edge, and without hesitation, without removing his jacket, without pausing to think, he dove. The splash silenced the crowd. Water swallowed him whole, cold and thick, filling his ears with a roar. His eyes stung, but he opened them anyway, his arms cutting through the murk with practiced strength. His muscles remembered. They remembered every drill, every lap, every early morning at the pool when he was young and strong and commanded respect. The water was not an enemy to him. It was an old companion. He surfaced once, drawing a quick breath, then angled himself toward the boy, who was slipping under again. The child's arms thrashed weakly, bubbles exploding around him as he sank. "Hold on, kid," the old man rasped through clenched teeth. Though the boy could not hear, he kicked harder, his legs slicing through the water with a rhythm that had been dormant for decades but never lost. The distance closed. He reached the boy just as his small head dipped beneath the surface again. The man lunged, wrapping one arm around the child's chest, turning him upward. The boy coughed, choked, eyes wide with terror, nails clawing at the man's shoulder. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice steady, commanding. "Breathe. Just breathe." He shifted the boy's weight, keeping his head above water. With his free arm and steady kick, he began the long swim back to shore. The crowd waited, stunned into silence. For the first time, they were forced to see him not as the ragged figure on the bench but as something else entirely. Every kick burned, every stroke dragged at his weary body. But he did not stop. The child clung tighter, coughing and crying, his tiny frame trembling. The man's mind sharpened to a singular point: the boy must live. Nothing else mattered. When his feet touched the lake's bottom, relief flooded him. He pushed forward until hands from the crowd reached out, pulling the boy onto solid ground. The child collapsed into his mother's arms, sputtering water, sobbing into her chest. She clutched him as if she'd never let go again. But the man remained half in the water, chest heaving, hair plastered to his forehead. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the boy's ragged sobs and the drip of water falling from the man's sleeves. Then, slowly, people began to realize what they had seen. The useless man, the ghost of the park, the one they ignored, ridiculed, pitied. He had been the only one to move, the only one to act. And in that moment, as he dragged himself upright, water streaming from his clothes, their eyes lowered, not in shame, but in something heavier, something closer to respect. The man didn't wait for their words. He turned away, limping back toward the willow's shadow, toward the weathered bench that had been his exile. His body ached, every joint screaming, but his heart beat with something it hadn't felt in years, life. Behind him, the crowd remained hushed, as though afraid to break the spell. A boy had been saved. A man had been reborn. And the lake, silent once more, held its secrets beneath the fading sun. For a moment, the park was no longer the park. The cries of relief, the murmurs of awe behind him, melted away into echoes of another time. Chlorine stung his nose instead of lake water. The rhythmic whistle of a stopwatch cut through the air. The slap of bodies diving into water. The synchronized churn of legs. The powerful strokes of athletes chasing perfection. He had lived inside that music once. It had been his world. Coach Miller, they had called him. Voices bright with trust and reverence. He had been someone, a man with purpose, with students who looked at him not with pity, but with admiration. He had shaped champions, taught fearlessness, drilled discipline until muscle remembered what the mind could forget. The pool was his kingdom, the water his ally, and now he was a shadow by the lake, a relic that no one saw until fate had shoved him back into the light. A child's cough broke through the fog of memory. He turned his head slightly, watching from a distance. The boy was safe, wrapped in his mother's arms. She rocked him, whispering words that shook with relief. The crowd was thinning now, but not without casting lingering glances at him. He felt their eyes like weights. Some looked with gratitude, others with unease, as though unsure what to make of the man they thought they knew. One of the fathers, a broad-shouldered man with a baseball cap, approached hesitantly. "Hey, thank you. If you hadn't," he faltered, as if unsure how to speak to him, as if the words of thanks did not belong in his mouth. The old man nodded once, curt, dismissing the need for gratitude. He had not done it for them. The father lingered, then retreated, scratching his head. The whispers started again. Who was he, really? How could he move like that? With such certainty, such strength, when only hours ago he had looked like nothing but a frail fixture of the park. He pulled his jacket tighter, the wet fabric cold against his skin, and turned his gaze back toward the water. It stared back at him, a mirror of the past he could never fully leave. Flashback, the pool. The year was 1989. The whistle's shrill cry echoed against tiled walls, bouncing back in sharp bursts. Young men and women launched themselves from starting blocks, arms knifing into the water. Their bodies surged forward in practiced precision, every stroke cutting clean, every kick propelling them toward the far wall. And at the edge of the pool, Coach Thomas Miller barked orders. His voice carried authority, not through volume but through conviction. Drive your legs. Don't fight the water, let it carry you. Again, his swimmers adored him. They feared him too, but it was the kind of fear born of respect, of wanting to meet the standard he set. Under his guidance, medals had been won, scholarships earned. He was a builder of futures. But futures, like tides, were fickle. Back on the bench, Miller rubbed his hands together, as though he could scrub away the years that had crusted over his life. He remembered the scandal, the whispers that had spread faster than truth ever could. A student injured, parents who demanded blood, an administration eager to find a scapegoat. It hadn't mattered that the injury was a freak accident, that he had done everything by the book. One headline, one angry board meeting, and his career had been stripped from him. He had fought, at first. He had shouted, pleaded, tried to claw back the dignity that was his. But the machine of rumor and reputation ground him down. The medals on the wall, the thank you letters from former students, they meant nothing against the weight of suspicion. And so he faded. Year after year, he became smaller, less visible, until the town remembered him only as the man on the bench. The sound of footsteps pulled him back. A boy stood in front of him, not the one he had saved, but another, holding a soccer ball under his arm. His face was open, curious. "Mister, were you, like, a swimmer or something?" Miller's lips twitched into what might have been a smile. Or maybe just a ghost of one. Something like that. The boy's eyes widened. "That was awesome. The way you, like, grabbed him and just swam. My dad says he can't even float." The boy laughed, then seemed to catch himself, shuffling his feet. "Anyway, thanks for saving him." He ran off before Miller could respond. For the first time in years, Miller felt the corner of his heart stir. Children, he thought. They still saw without the heavy filter of judgment. They saw what was, not what had been whispered. Behind him, two women muttered as they passed. "I still don't trust him. Just because he did one good thing." "Still," the other replied, "he saved that boy. That's more than any of us did." Their voices trailed off, but the words lingered. Miller leaned back against the bench, tilting his head toward the sky. The willow branches swayed above him, casting fractured light across his face. He had no illusions. Respect would not return overnight. Redemption was not a single act, no matter how dramatic. But maybe, just maybe, it was a beginning. And the water, dark and glistening under the sinking sun, seemed to whisper back to him, carrying echoes of both past glory and present possibility. He closed his eyes. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow he would return here. As always. But perhaps tomorrow, the stairs would be a little different. Perhaps tomorrow, the man on the bench would no longer be invisible. By morning, the story had spread farther than the ripples on Willow Lake. In the diner on Main Street, between the hiss of bacon on the grill and the clatter of coffee cups, voices rose with curiosity. At the hardware store, over stacks of lumber and nails, customers leaned in to share versions of the tale, each more dramatic than the last. By noon, everyone in town had heard. The old man from the bench had saved a child from drowning. For some, the story was a marvel, a spark of hope in an ordinary place. For others, it was a puzzle that didn't fit with the image they had carried for years. And for a few, it was an irritation, proof that perhaps they had been wrong to dismiss him. And people rarely enjoyed being proven wrong. At Willow Lake, Thomas Miller returned to his bench. As he always did, the willow branches swayed gently, their shadows painting lines across his weathered face. But this time, he was not invisible. Passers-by slowed their steps. Some nodded awkwardly, unsure if acknowledgement was welcome. Others stared outright, as if studying him for the first time. Two teenage boys, skateboards tucked under their arms, stopped nearby. One whispered, loud enough to be heard, "That's him. That's the guy." The other scoffed, though unease flickered in his eyes. "He still looks like a bum to me. Probably just got lucky." Miller didn't flinch. He'd grown used to the weight of words over the years. But inside, something stirred, a strange mixture of pride and weariness. He hadn't sought attention. The lake had simply demanded action. And he had answered. Now, the town wanted to turn it into a story. One that might say more about them than about him. A group of children played by the shore, their laughter carrying across the water. One of them, a girl with curly hair, waved at him shyly. He raised a hand in return. The gesture small but enough to light her face with a smile. That, he thought, was worth more than all the whispers. The sheriff's visit. The crunch of boots on gravel announced Sheriff Daniels. Broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp despite the dust of the road. He approached with a measured step. Daniels was not a man who wasted words. "Miller," he greeted, tipping his hat slightly. "Heard you played hero yesterday." "Just did what needed doing," Miller replied, his voice low, gravelly. Daniels studied him for a long moment. "You've still got it, don't you? The water in your blood?" Miller didn't answer. He wasn't sure he believed it himself. The sheriff sighed, shifting his weight. "Folks are talking. Some good, some not. You know how this town is. They remember things. They don't forgive easy." "I know," Miller said simply. Daniel's gaze softened, if only a fraction. "Still, you saved that boy. Don't let anyone take that from you." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Miller with more silence than before. At the grocery store, later that afternoon, Miller ventured into town. It was the first time in weeks he had stepped beyond the comfort of his bench and the path around the lake. The fluorescent lights of the grocery store felt harsh after the dappled shade of the willow. He moved slowly down the aisles, aware of eyes tracking him. A young mother whispered to her daughter, "That's him, sweetie, the man who saved the boy." The little girl's eyes widened. She tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Is he a hero?" The mother hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, honey, I suppose he is." But not all voices were kind. Near the dairy section, two older men leaned on their carts, muttering, "Hero, HMPH. He's still the same Miller. Don't forget what happened back then. Man like that doesn't change. Just got lucky, that's all." Miller heard every word. He didn't confront them. What would be the point? The past was a shadow that clung no matter how brightly the present tried to shine. The boy returns. As he stepped back outside into the cool air, a familiar voice called his name. "Mr. Miller." It was the boy he had saved, Ethan. His mother stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and hesitation. The boy broke free and ran up to him, his face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Miller, I wanted to say thank you. You were amazing, like a superhero." Miller crouched down, his joints protesting, but he managed a smile. "You're safe now, Ethan. That's what matters." Ethan's eyes sparkled. "Can you teach me? Teach me to swim like you?" The question hung in the air, heavier than either realized. The mother stiffened, her grip tightening on her son's shoulder. "Ethan, we don't want to bother Mr. Miller," she said quickly, but Ethan's gaze was locked on the old man. Hopeful, unafraid. Miller felt his throat tighten. Teach again? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. His past had been buried for so long. He had almost forgotten what it meant to guide, to pass on strength. "I'll think about it," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. Ethan grinned as if he had already heard yes. That night, back on his bench, Miller stared out at the lake. The whispers of the town swirled in his mind, praise, doubt, gratitude, suspicion. But above it all was Ethan's voice, clear and bright. "Can you teach me?" The water rippled under the moonlight, as if waiting for his answer. The morning air was crisp, cool enough to sting the lungs with every breath. Willow Lake lay calm, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple of a duck gliding across. Thomas Miller stood at the edge, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, staring at the water as though it might swallow him whole. Behind him came the scuff of sneakers and the unrestrained chatter of a boy. "Mr. Miller, I came, just like I said." Ethan ran up, his hair sticking up in messy tufts, a towel draped around his neck like a cape. His mother trailed after him, her steps slower, more hesitant. She clutched a folded lawn chair in one hand and a thermos in the other. "I don't know if this is a good idea," she said, her voice low, almost pleading. "He's still so young, and people will talk." "People already talk," Miller replied without turning. His voice carried the weight of resignation, but also a quiet defiance. "Better they talk about him learning than about him drowning." Ethan grinned, undeterred by his mother's worry. "Are we really gonna start today?" Miller finally looked down at him, at the boy's eager eyes. He nodded once. "We'll start." The first lesson. They waded into the shallows, the water cool against their ankles. Miller's movements were careful, his limp noticeable, but in the water, he seemed lighter, steadier. He instructed Ethan to sit on the edge first, dipping his feet in, feeling the water. "Swimming isn't about fighting the lake," Miller explained. "It's about learning to move with it. Trust the water. It can carry you, if you let it." Ethan kicked experimentally, splashing. He laughed, the sound bright against the quiet of the morning. "Like this? Stronger, but controlled. Don't waste your energy." Miller knelt beside him, guiding the boy's legs with patient hands. For the first time in years, his voice carried the old rhythm of instruction, the cadence that had once filled echoing pool halls. He heard himself again, not as a ghost, but as a coach. Ethan slid into the shallows, clutching Miller's arm. Panic flashed briefly in his eyes, but Miller steadied him. "Breathe. Look at me. You're safe." The boy nodded, chest heaving, then loosened his grip slightly. Miller showed him how to float, how to spread his arms, how to trust the water beneath him. When Ethan managed even a few seconds without clinging, his face lit with triumph. "You did it," Miller said quietly, pride threading through his voice. "I did it," Ethan shouted back, his joy echoing across the lake. Watching eyes, From the shore, his mother sat stiffly in her lawn chair, fingers white around the thermos. She wasn't alone. Word had traveled quickly, and soon others appeared, walkers on their morning route, teenagers skipping stones, an elderly couple holding hands. They lingered, pretending not to stare, but their eyes never left the water. "Is that old Miller really teaching again?" someone whispered. "Looks like it. God help that boy's mother. Doesn't she know what happened back then?" The words drifted to Miller's ears, sharp as knives. He kept his focus on Ethan. But inside, the old wounds ached. Every lesson, every command, felt like pushing against the tide of judgment. But then Ethan laughed again, splashing water in pure delight. And Miller's doubts eased. Whatever the town thought, this boy was learning. This boy was alive. Echoes of coaching. The days turned into a quiet routine. Each morning, Ethan arrived with his towel and boundless energy. Each morning, Miller guided him through drills, floating, breathing, kicking. The boy's progress was rapid, his fear melting into confidence. And each morning, more townsfolk appeared, drawn by curiosity they could not suppress. Miller began to hear new tones in the whispers. Less suspicion, more wonder. "He's good with the kid, isn't he? Never thought I'd see him teaching again." Still, shadows lingered. At the diner, men shook their heads, muttering that it was dangerous, that the past couldn't be erased by a single rescue. At the grocery store, mothers argued, was it safe to let a man like him teach children? Could he be trusted? Miller bore it all in silence. His purpose was not to convince them. It was to keep Ethan afloat, to pass on what he knew before the water swallowed another life. A breakthrough. One morning, clouds hung heavy over the lake, threatening rain. Miller considered canceling, but Ethan insisted. "I want to try the deep part," the boy said, determination burning in his eyes. Miller hesitated. The deep water was dangerous. But he saw the same spark in Ethan that he had once seen in his best swimmers, the hunger to push beyond fear. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but only with me beside you." They swam together, farther from the shore than ever before. Ethan kicked, arms slicing awkwardly but determinedly. His strokes were messy, his breathing uneven, but he didn't stop. Miller guided him, correcting, encouraging. Halfway to the boy, Ethan faltered. Panic flared. He gasped, his strokes collapsing. Miller was there instantly, steadying him. "You're all right. Don't fight. Breathe. Trust the water." Ethan forced himself still, floating as Miller had taught him. His breathing slowed, steadied, and then, with a deep breath, he tried again. Stroke by stroke, he made it to the boy. When his small hand slapped against it, he let out a triumphant cheer. "I did it," he shouted, his voice breaking with pride. Miller's chest swelled. He hadn't felt this alive in decades. "Yes," he said, his voice rough but steady. "You did." From the shore, applause erupted. The onlookers had grown into a small crowd. And for once, their faces showed not suspicion but admiration. Even Ethan's mother, tears streaming down her cheeks, clapped with the rest. Miller guided Ethan back to shore, his own body aching but his spirit alight. He knew the whispers would not vanish overnight. That scars ran deep, but for the first time, the tide seemed to shift. The man on the bench was no longer invisible. He was seen, not as a failure, but as a teacher once more. And as the rain finally broke, falling in silver sheets over the lake, Thomas Miller lifted his face to the sky and let it wash over him like absolution. The lake had grown louder with each passing day. What was once a quiet sanctuary now drew curious eyes and restless voices. People gathered not just to watch Ethan's lessons, but to watch him, Thomas Miller, the man they had ignored for so long. Some came with respect, tentative but genuine. Others came armed with doubt, whispering their suspicions as though the water itself might listen. And among them all was Harold Briggs, a man whose voice carried weight in town. A councilman, sharp-suited even on weekends. His eyes narrowed every time they landed on Miller. On the fifth morning of lessons, Briggs stepped forward, his tone slicing through the murmurs. "This has gone far enough." Miller looked up from where Ethan was practicing floating. The boy's laughter bright against the lapping waves. The crowd stilled. Briggs stood tall at the shoreline, arms crossed. "We all remember what happened," Briggs continued, his voice booming. "We remember the scandal, the injury, the disgrace. And now you want us to believe that this man, is safe to teach our children." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Miller's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had learned long ago that words often did less than silence. Still, the sting of old accusations burned. Ethan's mother stood suddenly, clutching her son's towel. "He saved my boy's life," she said firmly. "If not for him, Ethan wouldn't be here." Briggs sneered. "One good deed doesn't erase a lifetime of failure." His gaze swept the crowd. "Are you really willing to trust your children to him?" The silence was heavy. Miller felt it pressing against him like the weight of deep water. He turned back to Ethan, who clung to his arm with wide, fearful eyes. "Don't listen to them," Miller murmured. "Keep your focus." The challenge. It might have ended there. But fate has a cruel sense of timing. A scream tore across the lake once more. This time it wasn't Ethan. A group of teenagers, emboldened by the spectacle, had taken a canoe out onto the water. They rocked it too hard, laughter turning to shrieks as the canoe tipped, spilling them into the lake. Two scrambled back toward shore, but one, tall, gangly, panicked, floundered in the deeper water, thrashing wildly. The crowd erupted in chaos. "Someone call for help. He can't swim." Briggs froze, his authority crumbling in the face of raw fear. Eyes darted to Miller. For the second time in days, he moved without hesitation. The years fell away as he stripped off his jacket and plunged into the lake. The water closed over his head, cold and merciless, but his body remembered. Stroke after stroke, he cut through the waves, his breath steady, his mind clear. The boy's cries were weaker now, his movements desperate. Miller reached him, looping an arm around his chest. "I've got you. You're safe." The teenager sputtered, choking. I can't." "Don't fight it," Miller commanded. "Let the water hold you. Trust me." He hauled the boy back toward shore, every kick a battle against exhaustion. His limbs ached, his chest burned, but he did not falter. The shore loomed closer, the crowd's frantic cries growing louder. Finally, he stumbled into the shallows, dragging the boy with him. Hands reached out, pulling the teenager onto dry land. He coughed violently, spitting lake water, but he was alive. The turning point. The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in applause, relief, awe, gratitude. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers shook their heads in disbelief. Even those who had doubted found themselves silenced by what they had witnessed. Briggs stood at the edge, his face pale, his authority shattered. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His accusations drowned beneath the roar of voices praising the man they had once called useless. Ethan ran to Miller, throwing his arms around him. "I knew you could do it," he cried. His small frame shook with relief. Miller held him close, his own chest heaving with exhaustion. But inside, something unshackled. For so long he had carried the weight of disgrace. But now the town had seen with their own eyes. Not luck, not chance, skill, strength, purpose. A quiet aftermath. Later, as the crowd dispersed, whispers replaced applause. But these whispers carried a new tone. "He still got it. Maybe we were wrong about him. I'd trust him to teach my kid." Ethan's mother approached, her eyes soft with gratitude. "You've given him more than lessons, Mr. Miller. You've given him courage." Miller shook his head. He found that himself. "I only showed him where to look." The lake lay calm once more, its surface reflecting the late afternoon sun. For the first time in decades, Miller felt the weight on his shoulders lift, not gone, but lighter. The whispers would never fully fade. But respect, once lost, had begun to return, and in the town's eyes, the man on the bench was no longer a ghost. The days after the second rescue changed everything. Willow Lake was no longer just a place for quiet walks and idle fishing. It had become the heart of the town, where whispers gave way to conversations, and conversations to something more enduring. Children begged their parents to let them learn. Parents who once crossed the street to avoid him now sought him out. Their voices cautious but laced with respect. And always, there was Ethan. Each morning, he arrived with his towel, his grin, his boundless energy. Miller taught him not just how to swim, but how to listen to the water, how to trust himself. With every stroke Ethan mastered, the old man felt his own spirit healing, piece by piece. A town meeting. It was inevitable. One evening, the town gathered in the church hall, the wooden pews creaking under the weight of bodies and old prejudices. At the front stood Harold Briggs, his jaw set, still unwilling to surrender. This is dangerous, Briggs declared. We cannot allow a disgraced man, with a tarnished history, to be responsible for our children. We need rules, supervision, safety. Murmurs spread, but this time, they weren't all in agreement with him. A mother rose, her voice steady. My son is alive because of Thomas Miller. Another man stood. My daughter's been begging to learn. She trusts him. I trust him. Briggs scoffed. And what about the past? Have you all forgotten so quickly? A hush fell. Then Sheriff Daniels spoke from the back. His voice calm but firm. We all remember the past, Harold, but we also saw what he did, twice. The question isn't about what happened years ago. It's about who he is now. All eyes turned to Miller, who sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap. He rose slowly, the room silent. His voice was low, but it carried. I made mistakes, he said. I was blamed for things I couldn't change. And when the town turned its back, I let myself disappear. I stopped fighting. That was my failing. But water has a way of stripping things down, leaving only the truth. And the truth is, I can teach. I can save. If you'll let me, I'll spend what's left of my life giving back what was taken from me. And maybe from all of you. Silence followed, deep and heavy. Then, one by one, people began to clap. First hesitant, then louder, until the hall rang with applause. Briggs sat stiff, his face red, but the tide had turned. The town had spoken. The school by the lake. Summer unfurled its warmth over Willow Lake. What began as a single boy's lessons grew into something greater. A handful of children joined. Then a dozen. Parents sat on the shore, watching with cautious pride as Miller guided young arms through the water. His voice patient, commanding, alive. He moved differently now, still limping on land. But in the water, he was ageless. Every lesson was a bridge between past and present. Every child a reminder that his knowledge still mattered. He no longer hid from the whispers. They had become stories, carried with awe instead of disdain. Ethan swam with growing strength. His strokes clean, his breathing steady. One morning, he reached the boy on his own, raising his arms in victory. The crowd on shore erupted in cheers, and Miller felt his chest swell with pride that belonged not just to Ethan, but to himself as well. A quiet moment. That evening, Miller sat on his bench under the willow tree. But this time, he wasn't alone. Ethan climbed up beside him, dripping wet, towel wrapped tight. Mr. Miller, the boy said, his voice earnest. When I grow up, I want to be like you. Miller chuckled softly, the sound rough with emotion. No, Ethan, be better, be stronger. Take what I've taught you and carry it farther than I ever could. Ethan leaned against him, content. And for the first time in decades, Miller felt not like a ghost, but like a man whose life still mattered. The final swim. One morning, as the sun painted the lake gold, Miller slipped into the water alone. He swam with slow, deliberate strokes, not racing, not teaching, just moving, as he had when he was young. The lake embraced him, cool and familiar, a friend that had never truly abandoned him. When he emerged, the crowd that had gathered applauded. Not because he had rescued anyone, not because of scandal or redemption, but because they saw him, not as the man on the bench, but as Thomas Miller. Epilogue. Years later, they would tell the story differently. Some would remember the rescues, others the lessons, but all would agree, there had been a time when an old man by the lake reminded them what courage looked like, what redemption meant, and the willow tree, its branches dipping low over the water, would stand as witness to it all. The place where the useless man found purpose again. And where a town learned to bow its head, not in shame, but in respect.